life existence could be much deeper and more fulfilling than what it is right now. And that doesn't mean eliminating pain or controlling everything or having all the safeties and securities. It means that it could be a life and a death, well lived and died, with the other lives around us and with the planet that we're in and through the storms that we're facing. The point of life and death is to prepare people to become good elders and good ancestors. You can't live well if we don't know how to die well.
Hello and welcome. For those of you in London, England, or nearby, do join us for a picnic on Hampstead Heath this Saturday. You will meet some wonderful people and we will share stories, songs, and food. I was at a philosophy gathering last weekend called the Realization Festival, and I offered a workshop to connect to the land and to our deeper space of intuition and deep listening. It was incredibly beautiful, and some reported that they had experiences of feeling held by Earth and feeling in an intimate relationship with Earth that they'd never had before. We will do something like this with the trees of Hampstead, as well as gathering just to share and be together. The sun is going to be shining, so come and join us. Please visit our events page to register. There's a small donation which goes towards the production of this podcast, and there's a members discount, of course. My guest today is Vanessa Macedo de Oliveira Andreotti, or sometimes just referred to as Vanessa Andreotti, a Brazilian educator and Indigenous and lands right advocate. She is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Race, Inequalities and Global Change at the University of British Columbia. She is one of the founders of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Arts Research Collective and part of the coordination team of the Last Warning campaign. Vanessa is the author of Hospicing Modernity, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and Implications for Social Activism. She started working in the area of global learning as a school teacher in Brazil in 1994. She's led educational and research programs in various countries, including the UK, Finland, New Zealand, Brazil, and Canada. She has extensive experience working across sectors internationally, particularly in areas related to global justice, global citizenship, Indigenous and community engagement, sustainability, and social and ecological responsibility. Drawing on different critiques of colonialism and human exceptionalism, her research examines the interface between historical, systemic, and ongoing forms of violence and the material and relational dimensions of unsustainability within modernity. Drawing on her mixed family history and the work of her arts, research, ecology collective, Vanessa invites us to develop the stamina to face difficult and painful things together with more maturity, sobriety, discernment, and accountability, and to learn to activate senses and sensibilities that have been exiled by modernity and that can help us to sense, relate, and imagine otherwise. In this conversation entitled Embracing Our Pain, we explore the themes of radical tenderness, eldership, and decolonisation, where we speak to the question, how do we live and die well? I hope that this conversation opens up a new way of you relating to your life. Welcome to All That We Are, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration. The spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams. and we begin to embody all that we are, all that we are becoming, and all that is possible. Vanessa, it is such an honour and joy to welcome you to All That We Are. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing with us. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our first question that we're going to explore is, what is the futures of your wildest dreams?
It depends on what we mean by wildest dreams in the future. I work with cultures of vision. In Brazil, I come from also a genealogy of a culture of vision. My mom is Guarani, my dad is of German ancestry. And I do work with communities in Latin America, indigenous communities that, unlike our modern cultures, they do work much closer to the unconscious, to the place where the dreams come from. And they do not believe that our dreams are human. They believe the dreams come from the land. And they have all this preparation for us to be able to enable and allow the land to dream through us, through the ceremonies and the practices that they have. And they are suspicious of the dreams of the people who have been conditioned by modern society, right? So I've learned to be suspicious of my projections of the future, because generally we can only project into the future a slightly different image of our sensations of the present, how we would like to feel. Like, so if we want to feel well in the future, or a sense of togetherness in the future, or a sense of harmony, peace, you can only project what you already know. What these communities are showing us is that our bodies and everything that goes with them, including our entanglement with the body of the planet, there are ways of being well, that access to these ways have been restricted to us. In my work, I generally talk about this idea of the adjacent possible, things that are viable, like other ways of being well, but unimaginable. So we wouldn't be able to dream about them because our unconscious is also colonized, and our ways of being are colonized. And discolonization means that we're missing out on ways of being well, actually, ways of relating and being well that are beyond what we can fathom. That's partly, so I imagine something that is unimaginable, like that we will figure it out, how to live and coexist in ways that are not harmful to ourselves, to each other, to the other animals, and to the planet as a whole, where we are not preoccupied with our own temporality or the temporal aspects of our bodies, but where we activate this visceral responsibility towards everything, the whole shebang, and beyond our lifetime. So where we can set what's important in a time when we're no longer here. Yeah, I think in that sense, in the broadest possible sense, I think if I have any hope for the future, is the hope that we figure out how to coexist differently. And if we can't, if we're already in a path of premature extinction due to everything we're doing, then that we can die well. Our ways of living and ways of dying, there are many options there, that we learn how to die well would be another thing that's in the future. But there's one thing I think about this conversation too, that I see a lot, and this is to do with Western education and Western culture, that we tend to think about even hope or the future as an image that we project somewhere. And a lot of the time when we're projecting that image, we think that, okay, I need to have that before I can plan to arrive where that future is. But again, indigenous culture, not all of them, but the ones that I've worked with, many of them have this idea that the future, it's what we weave in the relationships of the present that create the future. So in a way, by making a projection of the future or hope in the future, we may be using that as an escape from the difficult work of dealing with what's difficult in the present. And in the project with my collective, we talk about it as composting shit, like the historical shit, the systemic shit that we have, and all the relationships that have been damaged So all the weaving that has been damaged, it requires a lot of stamina. It requires sitting with the pain, both of the land and of ourselves, and what we've done to each other. This is all difficult, and a lot of people use the future or hope in the future to turn away from the difficult work of sitting with that pain. We use that as a solution. And unless we can sit with that pain and learn the lessons of the recurring mistakes that we've made, we won't be able to make different mistakes. We will keep on repeating the same thing and imagining the future, thinking we're getting there. But the weaving that we are creating is the same weaving that has brought us to the place where we're at right now, right? So yeah, it's a very good question. And maybe the wild in their wildest dreams is not the dream of humans. It's the land dreaming through us about where we need to go, whether we are going to find another way to coexist or whether we learn to die well.
What does it mean to die well?
It's another good question.
I love what you say about the weaving in the present. I love how that doesn't need any vision. It just is. If we are able to pay attention and embody the present, then we can tend to the weaving.
Yeah, and I'm interested in what vision happens after we've done that. Because if the vision is happening before we can do it, then it's also restricting a possibility there. Maybe the vision that we see at the other side of the pain is very different from the vision that is trying to avoid that pain. And one of the things that we are told over and over as we sit with these different communities is that the fear of pain is worse than the pain. And if it's the fear of pain that is driving the vision, then we do have a problem, because then we're not facing what we need to face at the other side. And we are afraid of both the pain and of despair that comes as we face death. But again, another thing that we're told is that you can't live well if we don't know how to die well. This, I'm thinking also about, like, from the individual level to the collective level, as we face the climate catastrophe, as we face the rise in violence, as we face the global mental health crisis, right? It may be part of this is a crisis of us not being able to face our own mortality and to sit with it in a way that is generative and that activates that responsibility towards the beyond me. I recognize that at one layer, I am this body that is, actually I'm not this, but I have this body right now that is temporal. Then at another layer, I am me and you, me embedded and nested in other bodies, including all the relationships that I have around me. And then at another layer, then there is I am in you also as part of a different temporality, a much longer temporality of humanity. Then there is another layer where I'm neither me nor you, but there is an us beyond time and space and beyond the human form as well. So unless we can hold all these layers together and we see ourselves as much more than just this mortal physical body, it becomes very difficult to talk about accountability and responsibility towards other relations, because then it becomes a matter of choice of what I do with this life, rather than seeing yourself as part of a continuum of life that is much, much, much larger than an individual.
Given where we are in this particular moment, and I'm going to ask again about dying well, because it feels that we're a long way away from, like, a dominant culture really grasping what you just shared. I know that a lot of people listening to this are in a process of becoming in that way. But we're a small, tiny community.
Mm-hmm. What does it mean to die well? I think we are yet to figure that one out collectively, right? As we outgrow the limitations of the dominant culture. So it may mean something very different for communities that have lived in a way that not manifesting the level of separability from the land that we manifest in current consumerist metropolitan cultures. So this is something for us to figure out. But as we figure that out, we have to figure out how to age well too, and how to how to deal with time differently, how to see time also in multiple layers, and see our temporality and this inhabiting of an organic body very differently, how to relate to our unconscious very differently. Part of this, I think, is to shift our relationship with pain. So again, in dominant society, we are told that we can only be well if we are pain-free in the space, and then we imagine that space too as a space of bliss or a space of elation. But there are many different ways of feeling well where you can hold the hand of pain and be with it and befriend it. And of course, pain has many different roles. One of them is as a teacher. It's also an alert system in your body, right? That's something you need to pay attention to something. Many people say that we're always in a lot of pain, like our guts are in pain and our backs are in pain, but we numb it. And when you do massage, it's the releasing of that sensation that comes out. It's not that it's the pressure that is causing the pain, but it's the release of that pain. So part of dying well, I think has to do with time, then has to do with how to become elders, how in dominant culture, eldership is not something that is talked even about. If you age, you're losing value within society because the value is all placed upon youth or production. But there is something about eldership there that needs to change. So it's aging, time, and how we hold pain and also mistakes too. When I started doing this work, I had this idea that of an elder is somebody who's figured it out, how to live. But actually, when you start hearing the stories, it's more about a person who has learned to process the mistakes that we make and to create a language where you can pass something down to other generations so that the same mistakes are not repeated. You make those mistakes count, and you do that with grace, and you do that with humility, and that's a generous act as well. And that's actually, it's part of your responsibility to do it.
Or at least you can offer better tools if the same mistakes are made.
Exactly.
So that your younger generations have a different way of navigating those mistakes.
Absolutely. And once we lose those stories too, right? Or that kind of conversation, or we know we don't have the time anymore because we think that there's nothing to be offered, or when the elders themselves or people who age lose the capacity to do the processing too, and only see aging as like I say, a degenerative process, that there's a short circuit in this, and we are all shortchanged because then there's no pathway for maturity.
And the epidemic of degenerative illnesses that we have, from Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, these kinds of things that also take away the eldership time and are also a symptom of many of these ills that we have in our dominant culture.
And the sadness that comes with it, with this devaluation of your being, of your body, of your, once you're no longer productive, right? Then there's no other role that you can play, because this conceptualization of wisdom and the responsibility of the wisdom over your mistakes is no longer legitimized or acknowledged as important. And also the lack of a pathway, right? So there is a story that we use a lot with young people in our collective too, that was told by an elder, a Cree elder, John Cryer. The response that we have from young people is that this is a very important story to dance with because of a lack of a similar story in dominant culture. So it's a story of the 4 mountains. And it is basically a pathway to aging that comes through a metaphor. So the first mountain is the baby mountain, where you are received in the arms of your community to the world on one side of the mountain, and you're carried to the top of this mountain. And as you come down this mountain, you are gifted to your real parents, who are the land and the sky. So you are taking your first steps on the land as you go down the baby mountain, holding the hand of people from your family, from your community. But it's very important that your feet touches the ground and knows that ground, has intimacy with the ground. And that is your first teacher. And that is your mother, right? That's Pachamama, our Mother Earth. So as you change to the second mountain and you start going up the second mountain is the warrior mountain. And that could be a relationship with adolescence, but many of these cultures don't have a distinction. It's either you're a child and or an adult. There's most of them don't have the teenager as a figure, but I think there is resonance there with the warrior mountain. So in the warrior mountain, you are sent to a dark forest where the trees know who you are, but you don't. And you are curious to see what medicine you bring to the world. But then you start fighting the shadows of the trees because you want to know on your terms. And the trees, they trick you because you need to figure out to find your medicine on your own, but not on your terms, which is interesting. It's allowing the world to teach you. You need that humility as well. And as you reach the top of this mountain, you've learned like this medicine that you bring to the world. And as you go down the mountain, you are developing intimacy with that. You're cooking your medicine. It is for you first, and you need to know it intimately because it's both a medicine and a poison. You need to be very close to it and be very familiar to it. The next mountain is the mountain of the provider or the hunter, where you're going to learn to offer this medicine to the world, first to the people just immediately around you, and then on the other side of the mountain to more people. You learn to integrate this medicine with other medicines, which also means learning when to offer, when not to offer, when it is medicine, when it is poisonous, learning the amount that you need to offer at any time, learning to integrate it with other medicines. And then the last mountain is the elder mountain. As you start to walk towards this mountain, you have to pass through the other three mountains, especially the transition from the baby mountain to the warrior mountain, to the warrior mountain, to the provider mountain. And you become the person, as you walk towards the elder mountain, who support people to turn from one mountain to another. These are the rites of passage that we also miss in our dominant culture. And then you will see that the elder mountain is right behind the baby mountain, and they are connected. And there's where we learn that the babies need the elders because the warriors don't have the patience and the hunters don't have the time to be able to hold this baby as this baby needs to be held. The story is that as you go up the mountain, this elder mountain, at one point, midway, you need to shed your body. And as you shed your body to be able to keep going and crossing towards another side, the moment you shed your body, you realize you were never alone in this. Both the land, the other animals, the plants, and all your relatives were with you in this endeavor and trying to talk to you all the time. And you were learning how to distinguish between your own voices and the voices that you were receiving, both good and bad. Like it's not just this harmonious thing. There's also conflict there, but you're distinguishing how to understand and receive these different languages. And at that point too, you realize that the point of life and death is to prepare people to become good elders and good ancestors for all relations. So we took the story. The story was part of a project of Kesha Heneke, who's also an Indigenous scholar, who was asking people, like, what is the point of education, right? He went around, and John Cryer was one of the people that was part of this project, and he talked to many different elders in sacred sites, and nobody in any of this this conversation said the point of education is to have you productive in the dominant culture. The point of education was always along the lines of you need to prepare babies since they are born. You look at the baby and you already imagine the baby as an elder. And you see your responsibility in terms of this being as supporting this person to develop their medicine, to be able to become a good elder and ancestor for all relations. Maybe that's part of learning how to die.
How do we integrate a story like that when we live in such a different culture?
As the current culture fails more and more in offering us the possibility of a well-lived life and a well-died death, the cracks that start to appear, the cracks are where the stories can dance, right? When people are satisfied with the dominant culture, they're satisfied with the dominant culture. There's not much we can do. It's when this dominant culture can no longer hold the promises it makes. We go into a process of, okay, this culture doesn't hold the promise it makes. We need somebody to fix that. So you have a lot of people now, as we see the shaking, looking for strong leaders who will fix it and bring it back to the security and safety and comfort and entitlements and securities that people were expecting, right? So there's one way of thinking about it, and I think a lot of people will think about it that way. The other way is to say the promises of the dominant culture were unrealistic in the first place, but also sourced through violence. They were unsustainable and violent. And when you sit with that, it's really hard. And that's part of the composting of the shit. Like, how do we get disillusioned in a generative way? Because disillusionment should be a good thing. You're removing an illusion. But people tend to see disillusionment as something extremely painful, and it is painful, an undoing of the self and undoing of the world. But if you see that as an opportunity to actually find these cracks and these other stories that can then reactivate capacities that have been exiled by the dominant culture, in ways of being and ways of well-being that have been exiled by the current culture. And it doesn't happen like as a complete download. Now I know how to do it and off I go into the crack. No, it's slow. And all this undoing and this disillusionment, it takes some time for you to be in a position where you're not consuming these other stories just to feel a little bit better. Although in the beginning you do consume, because we're conditioned to consume everything. The stories are there to dance with you, not necessarily to be consumed. Most people will consume them first because that's what we're conditioned to do. We're conditioned to consume not only stuff, but also knowledge, critique, stories, experiences, relationships. And it takes some time for us to become dissatisfied with the consumption. And then we can start to interrupt it. And in this interruption, we open up the possibility of another form of relationship that is not a projective one or a transactional one. It's one that you allow, for example, the story to dance with you and to teach you on the story's terms rather than wanting to learn on your terms.
I feel that. I feel like deep in the cracks right now.
It's a good place to be.
Yeah, it's a real place to be. It feels real.
And there are no guarantees there of anything. But there's also a peace that is different from the controlled peace that we were taught to imagine. The one based on agreements, on reassurances, securities, predictability. I think in the crack, it's the space of possibility, the opening of the possibility of possibilities, without trying to suffocate it with your own idealization of what it should be. It's staying with that. Some people would call it mystery, other people would call it unknowability, but you feel that there's something they're calling to be allowed through. In the book, we talk about this concept of hospicing. Before we used assisting with the midwifery of the new, but it's actually the prenatal care. Now we're moving, because if we talk about the birth, people generally imagine themselves birthing. That is recentering again the ego to who wants the new to come through my body, right? So we're trying to say, okay, we need to decenter, disarm, declutter, and disinvest. So the hospicing is supporting a dignified death. And a dignified death in terms of the dominant culture is one where you're not trying to kill it or preemptively, but where you are allowing it to age and to teach its lessons. If it can't learn on its own, you're sitting with it and sitting with the mass of it to support it to reach that maturity at that point. But you're also cleaning up the mass. And it could be that you have to clean a lot of diarrhea and like the person is kicking and screaming of not wanting to go and not wanting to die. So you're learning with the thing dying within you and around you about what a good death could look like. We're trying to figure it out together with what is dying. This is one thing that needs to happen. The other thing is that we need to also support the prenatal care of what is coming, but without suffocating it with projections and idealizations and all this exceptionalism that we are taught to desire, that we are going to be the ones doing it. We actually don't know, like, what the thing that we can do to support this and this prenatal care is learn to hospice well, learn to die well, and learn to be present to it without being in front of it or on top of it. It's a process of growing up by growing down and becoming an elder as we learn to sit with all aspects of reality, the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up or the fucked up, and not turning away from that. And then it's only by sitting with all of this that we will be able to develop discernment about what do we want to feed, what we need to interrupt and contain. But it cannot be just about us. It has to be about our responsibility to the time when we are no longer here. And it cannot be a choice either. It has to be something visceral. So this is one thing that they keep saying to us in the ceremonies down in the South, is that if responsibility is a choice, an intellectual choice, or a matter of convenience, it's not responsibility really. The responsibility they are talking about, even neurobiologically, it's a kind of, think about a neurochemical that comes, is overpowering. You just need to do what is right, even if it goes against your self-interest, even if it makes you look ridiculous and pathetic, even if it costs you a lot, you will do it. The example that I have for that, and it's interesting because people then, if it's visceral, you're not even going to notice that you're doing it. But I have an example where we were in Peru and there were about 10 people wanting to cross the street. And it was a very busy street. And we were like thinking, are we going to do this? We would have to jaywalk too, because there was no stop sign for miles. And we had to go to the other side to get to a mountain and get to the place where we were going to. So we were there, and then this little dog that looked like a chihuahua, but like a baby chihuahua, came and started going. We could see different people having different reactions. So some people just put their hands in their ears, saying, okay, this is going to be horrible and I don't want to hear it. Other people put their hands in their mouth. Other people didn't want to see. And then this person in our group just went in front of the cars and stopped everything, stopped traffic, and the little dog went and crossed the street. The person also crossed the street. We all crossed the street, and off we went. And the person didn't even realize that they were putting their lives on the line for this tiny dog. And there was something that happened at that moment where both the being of that person, the being of the dog, and the being of the drivers all realized there was something bigger than any being that was there happening to stop traffic. There was no calculation. Basically, that person didn't calculate, well, when am I going to go and then be run over because of a little dog? Or would that driver be able to stop this? And if not, then like there's going to be an accident and more people are going to die. There was no calculation. There was just a moment, a crack in the time and space where a visceral responsibility act came through that was prompted by the little dog, but that created this learning moment for everybody where that person was asked to do something that put their lives on the line without calculation. So that's the kind of responsibility we're talking about. We will need to stop traffic everywhere. How do we prepare ourselves for that kind of call where you do need to put yourself in front of something and not think about not even being a hero? Like the person, when you talked about this later, the person didn't remember doing it. That's what I'm talking about. It's not, you're not doing it to be a savior of anything. You're doing it because you're really connected with that crack of time and that crack of space.
I love that. So an intuitive life is tapping into these cracks. The gift in that story is also the decentering of oneself.
And the interruption of the calculations that we do all the time for everything. And how much our vision and our dreams are also based on these calculations of how we want to feel, how we want to be seen, how we want to see ourselves. And at the end of the day, learning to die is learning to let go of these things. It doesn't matter, really. What matters is the doing and what the doing does and what informs that doing, because that doing is the weaving. And if you can connect to the weaving of the universe on the universe's terms, you can get to a situation where the drivers in that road, the little dog, and your body are in sync to do what needs to be done. Maybe the problem of the dominant culture is in the attempt to control everything, to index everything through language, then to control everything so that we can have predictability and maybe defeat death and pain, is that it lost the synchrony.
And then to do a profit and loss calculation economically as to whether it's worthwhile.
The worth thing is very interesting too, because the part of the problem is that because the dominant culture is based on the separation between us and the land and us and each other and the other animals and the plants and everything else, then what happens when we impose that sense of separation? And I believe it's neurochemically, it does that to us. It's a neurochemical that overrides the other neurochemicals that are possible there, where you don't feel separated and you feel responsible for everything. So there's a neurochemical overhaul where there's no intrinsic value of life. Your life is only valued if you produce value within a specific economy or within specific economies, not just the economy that we understand, but the, like, for example, intellectual economies, like where some ways of thinking are more valued than others. There are affective economies where there's transactions in our relationships of how I want you to make me feel, how you want me to make you feel. So there are different types of economies. You need to produce value.
How you're valued in a family system or in a work team or whatever it might be.
All of this is based on projections. So you have to perform to a certain construct, a certain projection. And that sense, then, unless you're doing this, you're worthless. So you have to keep trying to prove in the system that you're worthy of being alive. That in itself, and that's how it keeps us in the hamster wheel, right? Because we are afraid of the worthlessness that we will feel. We try to produce the values so that we can feel better and have a sense of belonging. But the very sense of belonging is belonging to a construct. Because if we remove the sense of separability, there's no way we don't belong, because we are already part of a bigger metabolism and in several different layers of this metabolism. So that the question of belonging would be a mute one. You're alive, you belong to all these different dynamic systems that are part of the planet. You have relatives and you are operating within organic self-organizing systems that are relational. But with the imposition of the sense of separability, the problem is that neurobiologically, you can't get yourself out of that necessarily on your own. It's like an addiction. You keep going back for that thing because there's no other input. So part of the thing that we need to figure out is that what could activate this other inputs of other neurobiological processes that our bodies can do, but have been prevented from doing. That's what we call the exiled capacities. And then I'm thinking about, just as an example, the capacity to collectivize our hearts, for example. So there is a neurochemical in the same way. And this is again, this was a teaching from Keith Chiefmoon, who's an elder here from Alberta, who's Blackfoot. The same way that our hearing you can kind of regulate still a little bit. We're losing this, but we can regulate whether you hear close or far. You would need much more of that if we were living on the land. But in the city, because of the amount of noise we hear, we're losing that capacity as well. But you can regulate whether you want to hear close or far. The same thing with your heart. You can regulate if your heart's going to be just here or if it's going to expand. And what this elder said at the time when we had that conversation was that collective pain cannot be held by an individual heart. It's overwhelming. Collective pain needs to be held by collectivized hearts. In Spanish, it's very beautiful. It's called corazonar. It's connecting the hearts to be able to hold more and witness the pain, because pain also needs to be witnessed so that it can move. And these are different processes. Number one, there's the learning to witness the pain. Number two, learning to collectively move the pain and learn from it what we need to learn for it to be able to move. Yeah, all these different capacities that we have, that because of our consumerist, metropolitan, hyper-individualistic, dominant culture, we haven't been able to exercise, they need to come back, because we will need them when things hit the fan. It's the end of the world as we know it. And at this end of the world, the capacities that we were left with by the dominant culture, we are not left us unequipped to face the storm and to weather the storm together. I was talking to someone yesterday, an artist who we were talking about a course, and we have been struggling with a sense of resentment towards other generations. So they're coming from a younger generation, looking at other generations and saying, you really shortchanged us. Now I thought I was going to have a family, a house, and be able to live the idealized life that the Hollywood films and everybody says we all should have, right? And we know that that's not going to be the case, because we have already reached the limits of the planet. And now we have to see how this is going to affect us, and then understanding that the privileges we have in the global north already require the end of the world for other people. And they are all based on the ends of the worlds and the social collapses of other societies. So now that we might face ourselves that prospect, what do we do? This person was saying, somebody else asked them, what would you like to be doing at the end of the world? And their response was, it's interesting, because the person put the question as, would you like to be partying or hiding? The response was neither. I don't want to be hiding. I want to be ready and in service for whatever happens.
Hospicing is the word, right?
Hospicing and offering prenatal care, right? I had never heard such a precise answer. And I thought, me too. Instead of running away from it, we will need to be able to face this, because it's in facing it that another possibility of existence or dying well arises. The dying well was there in that story, because they said, like, if I live or die, it doesn't matter at that point, but I want to be in service of those who are the most vulnerable, or who are suffering, or anyone who I can support and be in community with. And I said, yes. I love that answer.
It's a beautiful answer. And it makes me wonder what happens as more of us die to the version of ourselves we were told we were meant to be, as more of us die to all of those aspirations that we were given, and connect to something more grounded, more simple, more caring, but not in that way of, needing to be any of those things, just doing it because that's what's being asked of us.
That's very beautiful too, because then that's hospicing as well, right? The dying to the projections and aspirations and identities that were imposed on us, without necessarily wanting to create other idealizations to replace that, but staying in the crack where you don't need those things and you already belong. You have a slither of a piece of belonging that is not the belonging to constructs, but it's a foundational belonging to being in this planet at this time, experiencing this present in everything that's happening around you, the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up at the same time, and not turning away. But one thing about care that actually came up in the conversation yesterday too with the same person was that even care has been colonized. So and again, I'm quoting that they were saying that we conditioned to think and to relate to care as a responsibility to wash the pain of ourselves and of others. That again goes back to the coddling and the idealization of a life without pain. And they were saying, what would care look like? How does care manifest? Where growing old with each other, growing up and old and more mature with each other without running away from the painful bits of it. They said, we don't even know what to do in those circumstances, because we were not socialized in that. We were socialized in trying to rescue people from their pain and ask to be rescued from ours. Then we have to put that pain somewhere. We can't be rescued from it. The pain is there. And it's not just our pain, there's the pain of the land, the pain of what we're doing to each other. There's the pain of the whole world. And the only thing we can do to the pain is numb. So in many ways, our socialization is care. It could be of mutual numbing and saying everything is going to be fine, which then I would say it's coddling. What would care without coddling and without numbing look like? How can we actually hold this pain? How can we connect without being in the pain of the other? So if you're in pain and I want to offer care, I cannot be brought into your pain, but I can help you hold the pain from a different space and be able to both hold it and move it. Hold it, witness it, and move it, and not turn away.
Oh, this is just so on the bone of what life is teaching me at the moment. I'm caring for my mother with her Parkinson's. It's not going to magically get better. It's actually going to keep getting intense in new and difficult and surprising ways. With that, how do you not take on the pain? And how do you be real about what is unfolding? It's not something where you're like, it's going to be better soon. It just is. And I feel like in my life, like I really feel like in this crack, but I feel like I have a hand on the ledge, just in case there's a possibility that I can crawl myself back out. Yeah. And so to fully allow and embrace the crack.
And the circumstances too of hospicing there, because there are many different layers of hospicing, and I think Parkinson brings it very present to you about the mortality of your family members, your own mortality, the mortality of everything around, the temporality of everything around you, and the inevitability of change. There's something about this unconditional cooperation with the inevitable, that you need to befriend the process. And there are things in this process that we need to accept, but not necessarily endorsing it. Learning of the practice of acceptance without endorsement of certain things, because acceptance doesn't mean endorsement. Endorsement is something else. There are things we accept with endorsement. There are things we accept without endorsement, but without turning away. Or imagining a world where just numbing to that, erasing that from your idealized version of reality. So maybe part of it is also understanding that these idealizations, although they look delicious and maybe they have a place somewhere, some point, but the way that they are being used right now is making us unprepared and unequipped to deal with what's presenting and unfolding before us. So you would be in a much worse position, because the problem is that the idealization creates the resentment towards reality. So if you want to hold on to the idealized version of yourself and what you could be doing and who you could be and the happiness you could have. And while you have to look after your parents in the process of their passages and aging and sometimes degenerative illness, you are going to be resenting what you didn't have if you hold on to the idealization. Another way to sit with it is to say, what's coming, what's in there is going to change me profoundly through the process of it's going to teach me profoundly about dying well, about relating differently to pain, about holding the hand of pain, not being in pain, but holding the space for pain and supporting others to do that. Because maybe there is a metaphorical connection between what is happening here and what the world is also going through.
For sure. And there's a similar taste of, the like, how did this happen? And this is to do with dominant culture, lifestyle, and like all of these different factors that say have created like these diseases that a lot of the elderly are facing. And we don't know what diseases our generation are going to be in 20, 30, 40 years as well. And it mirrors exactly the feelings of what we're feeling with what is happening in our systems and to our earth and to all of our other species. And that same thing, like, how did we live in a world that lets this happen, that does not respect and honor the sacred, and then leaves us in this place where things are literally dying around us, and people, not things, but things as in systems, people, animals, dreams, possibilities, all of that, to be able to step into a different kind of set of skills that were not the skills that we were educated in order to be able to be present in this time. It's a big ask. It's like you get raised like watching movies and eating popcorn, and then it's like, okay, and now.
And there are no reference, right? So you go to Netflix, there's nothing there. Well, you can see the cracks there too sometimes. Yeah. And it would be great to curate where all the cracks are, but mostly it's still selling the same thing.
We are taking just a short pause here. If you are enjoying this episode, please consider joining our community. For a small contribution, you can be part of our beautiful online world, where we deepen the conversation and offer spaces of learning and practice. As a member, you are a patron supporting the making of this show, and you receive a number of benefits, such as special member-only events and discounts on all our courses, retreats, and in-person experiences. You will have membership to our app and connect with inspiring humans around the world through a social network to discuss the themes of the show away from the eyes of advertisers and the manipulation of big tech. Our membership is what makes us able to stay advertising free in a world that is always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. And it is the very heart of all that we are. Head to www.allthatweare.org/support to find out more. There is a part of your book that you wrote about co-sensing radical tenderness, and it is an incredibly beautiful passage and powerful passage. Do you want to speak a bit to radical tenderness?
So that was a collaboration with Dani D'Emilia, who's an artist, Brazilian and Italian queer activist as well. We worked together in order to see, it's a text with, I think, 55 invitations for people to develop a practice of healing and well-being. Actually, we called it a political practice of healing and well-being, where they can stay at this interface between being critical and loving at the same time, and walk the tightrope the way that we've been talking about it recently. The skills that you talked about that we need to learn, it's like an acrobatic, really, because it requires us to, when you feel worthless, it looks like what you want is people to tell you that you're worthy, Or if you feel ugly, that you want people to tell you that you're beautiful. It's the same in like fat shaming, the opposite is fat celebration. What this text tries to do is to say, like, staying in the seesaw is not going to help. We need to get to zero. We need to break the code of what's creating the worthlessness, the sense of ugliness, what is making us pay attention to this hierarchical value of things. This is not dialectics, because dialectics requires you to like progressively jump from one thing to the other. It's not dialectical, it's analectic. It asks you to take a step back and look at the choices you have and say, where do they come from? Are they going, and what choices are being erased as we are presented with just two choices, right? Then this text being about deactivation of harmful things that are harmful desires and entitlements that we have, and the reactivation of exiled capacities that we will need to be able to face our shadows, compost our shit, and weather storms together. And this requires this learning the acrobatics of walking a tightrope with both intellectual rigor and relational rigor. So that's the rod, and learning to balance both intellectual and relational rigor. Understanding that if you stop in a tightrope, you fall. If you walk too fast or in an unbalanced way, you also fall. So you have to find your pace and your rhythm. If you fall, what's under there are two things. It's either desperate hope, where you think that somebody's going to save us, or a certain group, or a certain ideology, or a certain practice, or a certain like this nostalgic return to a certain time, or the escape into nature. All of that, these are all desperate forms of hope. But there's also the other side of it, is desolate hopelessness, where then anything goes, or you're just going to live your best life and hate humanity, or you start to trivialize cruelty. So there's lots of things in that void that you fall, that you don't want to fall into. But basically, they are in the categories of desperate hope and desolate hopelessness. So you learn to walk that tightrope with honesty, which means making space for the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up within and around you, and you not turning away or feeling overwhelmed or irritated or immobilized. So you sit with all of this and you can walk with all of this. The second thing is humility, where you shed your arrogance, and that can mean many different things. The idea of decentering, disarming, decluttering our lives and unconscious too, and disinvesting in what's harmful. Then you have hyper self-reflexivity, which is understanding where you're coming from, where you're at, and not exactly where you're going, but having a sense of the implications of what you're weaving in the present. And the last thing is humor, but it's a specific kind of humor where you can see and you can laugh at yourself and see yourself as cute and pathetic in the greater scheme of things, trying your best, but also see the humor and the absurdity that we find in all kinds of aspects of life, but without ridiculing. So it's not ridiculing humor. It's a humor that is the lightness that you need to be able to deal with heavy things. And all of this is geared with a compass of, we call it decolonial forms of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability. So decolonial sobriety is the interruption of your addictions, including the addiction to consumption. Understanding that this language is complicated because addiction is weaponized against people who have problems with chemical dependency. So we're using it carefully here. Maturity is what we've been talking about in terms of learning to die well and to grow old by growing down. Then there is discernment, which is the ability to layer things and understand that the tensions and paradoxes and contradictions are part of everything within and around us. And accountability, but linked to that sense of visceral responsibility we were talking about before in the story of the little dog crossing the road, right? It's not a choice. It's not a matter of convenience. It's something that comes from the guts, through the heart. The head follows and puts you in a position where you receive a call that is beyond yourself to do something that may go against your self-interest, and that you don't have a choice but do it.
Thank you. It's so powerful. I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned right at the beginning, which was the colonization of our consciousness. And if this is something that you believe can be decolonized.
So the colonization of the unconscious. So that's what I was talking about. But I think the colonization of the consciousness is another thing that should be talked about too. I think both the unconscious and the colonization of consciousness is not something that we tend to look at carefully. Generally, we tend to look at colonialism as the subjugation of lands, the subjugation of people, and the occupation of lands. We don't think about the colonization of our being and how that the restrictions imposed by the colonial project, which is at the heart of the dominant culture, those anchors, both in terms of ways of thinking and reasoning, ways of relating, and ways of existing in the world, how restrictive that is and what we're missing out on, right? In terms of the many different possibilities that are out there for being that we don't think about. But I don't want to romanticize that too. There are many possibilities of being that are worse even than what we have right now. But I don't think this is the best one that we could possibly have either. We could have the discernment to say life, existence could be much deeper and more fulfilling than what it is right now. And that doesn't mean eliminating pain or controlling everything or having all the safeties and securities. It means that it could be a life and a death, well lived and died, with the other lives around us and with the planet that we're in, and through the storms that we're facing, and overcoming together, or at least wrestling together with the struggles that we're wrestling with. What we tend to imagine as decolonization is just a removal of all the obstacles. And this is not, this is a sterile form of life. Or we tend to imagine it as liberation. But we don't understand is that, yes, there are corporations and governments curtailing freedoms, but there are also internal processes that are limiting who and what we can be.
Wow. Thank you, Vanessa. There is so much there. This is a conversation that I invite our listeners to listen to multiple times, sat by trees and next to rivers, walking through a concrete city, and to see how it can land and integrate and dance. What is the call to action that you want to leave our friends here with?
I think the radical tenderness text is probably the best call to action. It's an invitation to co-sense with radical tenderness, but I would love to hear you reading it, actually.
This text is a real gift. I would also like to thank my dear friend and collaborator, Azadeh Momangalibaf, who left me this text in a voice note. I was just like, I didn't know how much I needed someone to read this to me. Co-sense with radical tenderness and accept its invitation to be present. Tune in with the collective body, both human and non-human. Take note of all the skins and places we inhabit, the bones and lands that bear our weight. Feel your entanglement with everything, including the ugly, the broken, and the messed up. Relate beyond desires for coherence, purity, and perfection. Co-sense with radical tenderness and dance beyond the loop of identification and disidentification, beyond what you like and dislike. Stop trying to shape reality according to narcissistic compulsions for pleasure, comfort, and convenience. Interrupt addictions to consumption, not only of stuff, but also of knowledge, experiences, and relationships. Let go of possessions, of possessiveness. Renounce fantasies of comprehension, consensus, and control. Disarm, declutter, and decenter yourself. integrate with a wider metabolism, with a much longer temporality than your human body. Follow non-normative and non-linear time. Deactivate your cravings for protagonism, greatness, and legacy. Stop fearing fear, uncertainty, and emptiness. Be open to the gifts of disillusionment and dissolution. Surrender without collapsing. Co-sense with radical tenderness and make space for the unknown and the unknowable in ourselves and in others. Seek sensefulness rather than meaningfulness. Allow your state of wonder to stay open without always trapping it into meaning. Don't hold being hostage to knowing. Engage with creativity beyond the intellect. Recover exiled capacities, expand sensibilities, and disimmunize intimacies. Notice the ways in which our thoughts and emotions are biophysical processes. Listen to non-human authorities and care about our relationship with them. Be open to what you can't and may never understand. Don't cast upon everything a blanket of interruption. Silence the noises preventing you from digging deeper and relating wider. Co-sense with radical tenderness and be receptive to the teachings of your shadows. Mourn your illusions, compost your shit, ferment yourself. Learn from repeated mistakes. Make only new ones in the future. Discover a whole bus of different creatures inside yourself. Look into the mirror and release the fear of disappointment, rejection, and abandonment. Face your complicity in violence and disinvest from arrogance, superiority, and status. Let go of the fear of being less, the pressure of being more, and the need for validation. Offer the gifts of your failure. We all fuck up. We all cry. Deactivate your expectations for belonging and focus on unlearning the logic of separability. Embrace yourself as both cute and pathetic. Be courageously vulnerable. Co-sense with radical tenderness and make room for new forms of coexistence to encounter you. Renounce unrestricted autonomy and the obsession with form. Find stability in the rhythm beneath the movement. Activate the sense of hearing in all parts of your body so that through witnessing we can heal one another. Listen to unmuttered wisdom, nurturing intrinsic rather than productive value. Remember that our medicines are both indispensable and insufficient. Let us have each other's backs rather than back each other up. Tune in rather than empathize with. There's a difference. Notice how you move between your comfort, stretch, and panic zones. Increase care in proportion to risk. Do it with humility, generosity, and reverence. Dissolve the limits and weight of your body, allowing others to move through, with, and for you. Co-sense with radical tenderness and turn the heart into a verb. Corazonar, senti pensar. Look at painful and difficult things with the love of really wanting to see. Feel the pain of the earth piercing you. Understand that the earth is not an extension of our bodies, it's the other way around. Collectivize your heart so that it breaks open and not apart. Let it hold all the pain of and in the world without being numbed or overwhelmed. Witness being in several layers, me in you, me in you, us in neither me nor you. Forget being either or, be both and more, and moving. Tend the wounds created when the skin holding one body stretches and tears in order to receive and be reconfigured by another. Condition your intellectual, political, and affective muscles for facing storms and running marathons in torrentious terrains. Allow yourself to be guided by a metabolic intelligence. Enable neurogenesis and learn to breathe water, be water. Co-sense with radical tenderness and practice engaged detachment. Offer palliative care to the dystopian world that is dying, both within and around us. Digest the teachings this death offers. Co-sense with radical tenderness and assist with the birth of something new, without suffocating what is being born with projections and idealizations. Co-sense with radical tenderness and invoke and evoke in a double and simultaneous movement the manifestation of a political practice of healing and well-being beyond what human intelligence can fathom. Allow it to come through you, forever changeable and fluid. These words that you and Danny brought to us are so powerful and so beautiful. Thank you for this work.
Thank you, Amisha. I didn't realize, and we didn't plan this, but it's interesting that the conversation was around the text. And thank you for bringing it up at the end and for reading it beautifully. It's always so different to receive it back, because we don't think that, like in the process of writing too, the words came through, so we don't take ownership of that. But it was very powerful to receive it too. Thank you.
It's also the quality of your listening to the words as they come through you that brings them into the world. Vanessa, it has been beautiful to spend this time with you. How would you like our friends listening to connect with you?
So there is a website called decolonialfutures.net where you will find probably 60% of the book, Hospice in Modernity, is actually there under Creative Commons. So that would be the first stop. The website is not necessarily very user-friendly, but because it's a workspace for a collective. But if you go into artistic experiments and the different types of experiments, you will see what we've been cooking and trying to integrate as the medicine of the collective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening and spending your time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on allthatweare.org. We give space to our guests to share their perspective without debating it or fact-checking, as this approach allows for deep, unedited conversations from the heart. We trust your discernment and wisdom to take what is useful and challenge what isn't in your own understanding. We offer spaces for discussion and integration in our membership community. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our beautiful community. If you loved this and would like to connect more deeply with us, please join our membership. For less than a tea or coffee a day, you can access our community conversations and benefits such as our app and member gatherings, as well as being a patron whose support makes this podcast happen. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen so others find us. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. It invites the full power of the more than human world, nature, the unseen, our ancestors and our future generations. It reminds us that we never exist in silo, through borders, timelines, or polarity, that in each and every moment, all that we are is here.